He scolded his son for having a useless bull and wanted to sell it for pennies. But a few minutes later, that bull saved their lives. Look how the storm ended. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun rose slowly over the wide plains of Wyoming, casting a pale gold light across the pastures and the weathered fence lines that traced the perimeter of the Harper Ranch. The earth was still damp from recent spring rains, and the smell of wet soil and manure hung in the cool morning air. Dew clung to the wooden rails and the tall grasses that dotted the pasture, catching the light and glittering like a scattering of small stars. A few blackbirds perched on the posts, their calls sharp and clear in the stillness of dawn. Life on the ranch always began early, but mornings in spring carried a special weight, a reminder that work had to be done before the heat of the day set in. Elias Harper stood at the gate, his hands resting on the top rail as he surveyed the herd. At 60, he was a man carved by decades of wind and sun, his skin weathered, his shoulders stooped, not by weakness, but by the quiet gravity of a man who had spent his life fighting for every inch of his land's productivity. His eyes moved across the pasture, counting without really counting, a skill honed over so many years that he could sense when something was amiss before he even finished his inspection. He spotted the familiar bulk of the cows near the water trough, a few calves frisking about, and then his gaze settled on a single figure standing apart from the rest. Rain, the scrawny bull who had been a subject of irritation for months, lingered near the far end of the pasture. He was smaller than the others, with jutting ribs and a patchy, uneven coat that made him look as if he had only recently recovered from illness, though he had been declared healthy by every test the veterinarian had run. Elias narrowed his eyes and pressed his lips together. The bull did not look much improved since winter. He was eating, yes, but slower than the others, as if he had no real interest in competing for the best feed. The rest of the herd seemed to ignore him, which was unusual for animals that often followed a pecking order. Rain was tolerated, but not respected. Elias shifted his weight and exhaled heavily through his nose. He knew the math by heart. Every head of cattle on this ranch had to justify its keep. Feed was expensive, and spring was a delicate season when resources had to be managed carefully. Keeping an animal like Rain, who showed no promise of becoming a strong breeding bull, was a luxury he couldn't afford. The next auction date was coming up soon, and Elias had already been thinking about which animals to cull from the herd. Rain had been at the top of that mental list for weeks. From the other side of the pasture, a lean figure came into view, carrying a feed bucket almost as large as himself. Luke Harper, Elias's 14-year-old son, moved with the awkward confidence of a boy caught between childhood and manhood. His boots were too big, his hat always a little crooked, but his hands already bore the small scars of hard work, and his walk had started to resemble his father's slow, deliberate pace. Luke crossed the muddy ground with practiced ease, calling softly to the cows as he went. A few of them lifted their heads in response, lumbering toward him, but Rain did not move. Luke's attention fixed on the solitary bull almost immediately. He had been watching Rain for months, sneaking out after school to bring him extra feed, or simply sit near the fence and talk to him. The bull, for reasons Luke could never explain, seemed different from the others. His dark eyes were alert in a way that struck Luke as unusual, almost intelligent, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. That strange stillness made Luke feel strangely protective of him, as though the bull's fate somehow mattered more than the rest. By the time Luke reached the gate, Elias had already started walking back toward the barn. He did not need to speak to make his decision known. He carried himself with the resolve of someone who had already made up his mind. The boy fell into step behind his father, glancing back over his shoulder at the pasture where Rain still stood, motionless. Luke's heart thudded with unease. He had a strong sense that time was running out. Later that morning, The familiar rattle of a truck engine announced the arrival of Jessica Rowe, the local veterinarian. Her white pickup rolled into the yard, its sides spattered with mud from her rounds. She climbed out with her medical kit, brushing dust from her jeans and waving briefly to Elias. Jessica had been coming to the Harper Ranch for years, and she knew every cow, calf, and bull by sight. Her relationship with Elias was one of mutual respect. She appreciated his no-nonsense approach to animal care, and he trusted her judgment when it came to difficult decisions. They walked together to the pasture where Rain stood, still apart from the rest of the herd. Jessica crouched slightly, observing the bull's stance, the way his ears flicked toward distant sounds, the condition of his coat and eyes. She took his temperature, checked his breathing, palpated his ribs. Everything seemed normal except his weight, which remained stubbornly low, despite a good appetite and clean bill of health. "He's not sick," Jessica said finally, wiping her hands on a rag. "Just undersized. Some bulls never really fill out the way you want them to. You might get him there eventually, but it'll take time and feed. You may not want to spare." Elias nodded grimly. This was confirmation, not new information. He stood in silence for a long moment, watching the bull toss his head slightly, as though annoyed by their presence. "Auction's next week," Elias said at last, mostly to himself. The decision was as good as made. Luke, who had been hovering nearby, felt his stomach knot. He didn't say anything right away. He knew better than to argue when his father had that look in his eye. But as they walked back to the house, Luke's mind worked furiously. Selling Rain would mean erasing all the hours he had spent trying to bring the bull back to health. It would mean losing the one animal on the ranch that he felt truly connected to. That evening, Luke lingered outside after chores were done, sitting on the fence near where Rain stood. The bull watched him, ears forward, body relaxed, but alert. Luke talked to him in a low voice, as if explaining what was about to happen. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and hay, and for a moment it seemed as if the world were holding its breath with him. When he finally went inside, Luke found his father at the kitchen table, ledger open, pencil in hand. Elias was tallying feed costs, vet bills, and projected profits from the coming season. Without looking up, he mentioned again that Rain would go to auction, his voice calm and final. Luke stood still for a long time before speaking. His voice, when it came, was steady, but quiet. He asked his father for one season, just one to see if Rain could prove his worth. He promised to take full responsibility for the bull's care, to make sure he was fed, groomed, and kept healthy without adding to the ranch's expenses. Elias looked at his son for a long moment, reading something in the boy's eyes that made him pause. Perhaps it was the seriousness there, the first real sign that Luke was no longer a child, but someone capable of taking responsibility. At length, Elias gave a short nod. "One season," he said. The words were not tender. They were almost a test. But for Luke, they felt like a small victory. That night, as the house settled into silence, Luke lay awake in bed, thinking of what he had promised. He would have to rise earlier than anyone else, do extra work after school, and put everything he had into saving Rain. Failure would mean seeing the bull loaded into a trailer and sold to strangers. The thought filled him with a mixture of dread and determination. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling through the cottonwoods that lined the ranch yard. In the distance, Rain let out a low, deep sound that echoed faintly across the pasture. Luke heard it through the open window and took it as a sign, a strange, almost reassuring reminder that the bull was still there, still waiting. The boy turned onto his side and closed his eyes, his mind already planning the work that lay ahead. He had one season to prove to his father, and perhaps to himself, that some things were worth fighting for. Morning came earlier for Luke than it ever had before. The faint glow of dawn had barely touched the horizon when he slipped out of bed, pulling on his boots and jacket in the dim light of his room. The house was still quiet, his father asleep in the next room, the smell of last night's fire lingering faintly in the air. Luke moved softly, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped outside into the chill of the Wyoming morning. His breath clouded before him as he crossed the yard, heading straight for the feed shed. The season had only just begun, but Luke was already learning what it meant to take on responsibility. He measured out Rain's portion of grain with meticulous care, adding a bit more than usual, and carried the bucket to the far end of the pasture where the bull stood waiting. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through the cuffs of his jeans, but he didn't mind. There was something satisfying about the sound of the grain shifting in the bucket and the way Rain's ears flicked forward at the sound. Rain was slow to approach, as always, but when he did, Luke could see that the bull's ribs were just a little less prominent than before. It was a small change, but it filled Luke with quiet hope. He waited patiently as the bull ate, stroking the coarse hair along Rain's neck. The animal seemed calmer when Luke was near, as if the boy's presence reassured him. Days turned into weeks, and this new rhythm became Luke's life. School, chores, Rain. When other boys his age were spending their afternoons at the creek or playing ball, Luke was sweeping out the stall, hauling buckets of water, and cleaning the feed trough. He discovered that work done alone had a different weight to it. No one watching, no one praising, just the quiet knowledge that it had to be done, because he had given his word. His hands grew calloused, his shoulders ached, but he never once complained. The ranch hands noticed, of course. They made comments as he passed, good-natured at first, then teasing. Some said he was wasting his time on a bull that would never amount to anything. Others laughed that he was trying to turn a runt into a prize winner. Luke ignored them. He had promised his father, and more importantly, he had promised himself. Little by little, Rain changed. His coat grew shinier, the dullness fading to a healthier gloss. His eyes seemed brighter, more alert, and he moved with a bit more strength in his stride. He was still smaller than the other bulls, but he was no longer just skin and bone. Luke felt proud every time he saw him stand shoulder to shoulder with the others, even if they still pushed him away from the best hay. One afternoon, late in April, Luke noticed something strange. The sky was a brilliant blue, only a few clouds drifting lazily over the mountains, but rain would not settle. He paced near the fence, tossing his head, snorting softly, and staring toward the western horizon, as if waiting for something. Luke tried to coax him with grain, but the bull ignored it, his body tense, ears flicking constantly. That night, not long after Luke had gone back inside, a storm came out of nowhere. The wind howled, slamming the shutters, and rain pelted the roof in sheets. In the darkness, Luke lay awake, listening to the thunder crack over the prairie. He thought of Rain pacing restlessly that afternoon, and wondered if somehow the bull had known what was coming. The next morning, when the family went out to inspect the damage, they found the old hay shed had lost part of its roof. A few fence posts had been blown over, and a dead branch had fallen near the corral, but nothing more serious had happened. Elias grumbled about the work it would take to fix it all, but Luke kept thinking about Rain. The bull stood near the barn, calm now, chewing slowly as if nothing had happened. Luke told himself it was just coincidence. Animals acted strangely sometimes, and storms came quickly in Wyoming. But the thought stayed with him, nagging quietly at the back of his mind. When, a few weeks later, Rain showed the same restless behavior on another cloudless day, and another storm rolled in by nightfall, Luke began to wonder if there was something more to it. Through May, the pattern repeated. Whenever Rain grew agitated, bad weather followed within hours. Sometimes it was just a sharp wind or a sudden downpour. Sometimes a thunderstorm strong enough to rattle the windows of the farmhouse. Luke started to pay attention, keeping mental notes of each time it happened. It was as if the bull could feel the weather changing before any human could see the signs. Elias, for his part, remained skeptical. When Luke mentioned what he had noticed, his father only shook his head. Coincidence, was all he said, and went back to his work. There was no room for superstition in the running of a ranch, but Luke felt more certain with every passing week that Rain was different. By early June, the pastures had grown lush and green, the herd content and fattening for the summer. Rain had improved enough that even Elias admitted he looked better, though he still muttered that he would never be the bull he wanted for breeding. The auction date loomed closer, and with it came a knot of anxiety that Luke could not shake. He had done everything he could, but would it be enough to convince his father to let Rain stay? One evening, after a long day of mending fence lines, Luke stayed out past sunset. He sat on the top rail of the corral, watching the sky darken to deep violet. Fireflies began to flicker in the grass, and somewhere far off a coyote yipped. Rain stood nearby, head lowered, pulling at the grass with slow, deliberate bites. The boy felt an odd sense of peace, as if in that moment the world was balanced on a knife's edge, quiet before some unseen change. He thought about the first day of spring, when he had begged his father for just one chance. He thought about the hours spent hauling water, shoveling manure, carrying feed until his arms ached. He thought about the storms, and how Rain had always seemed to know when they were coming. It wasn't just about keeping the bull alive anymore. It was about proving something to his father, to the ranch hands, maybe even to himself, that he was capable of more than just following orders. As he climbed down from the fence and headed back toward the house, the sky flashed briefly with distant lightning, though the air was still and no thunder followed. Luke felt a shiver run down his spine. Perhaps Rain wasn't the only one who could feel that something was coming. When he returned to the house, Elias was sitting at the table, ledger open, frowning at the columns of numbers. The man looked up briefly at his son but said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither wanted to say. Luke washed his hands, ate his supper, and went to bed. But sleep did not come easily. He knew the day of decision was drawing closer. Soon, he would find out whether the work of an entire season had been enough to change his father's mind, or whether Rain would still be loaded into the trailer and sent away. Somewhere out in the pasture, the bull lifted his head toward the dark horizon, and Luke, staring at the ceiling, felt as though they were waiting for the same thing. By the time July rolled in, the air over the Harper Ranch had taken on the heavy stillness that always preceded the hottest weeks of summer. The grass in the pastures had turned a deeper green, waving in the warm breeze, and the cattle spent their afternoons clustered in the shade of the cottonwoods or standing belly-deep in the shallow creek that ran through the western field. It should have been an easy season, the sort of quiet time that allowed a rancher to take stock of his herd and plan for the next breeding cycle. But for Luke, the quiet only made the dread in his chest feel sharper, louder. The auction date had been set, and his father was sticking to the plan. Elias had been watching Rain closely all summer, and though he admitted that the bull had filled out some, he still wasn't satisfied. To him, Rain was just a middling animal, better than he had been in spring, but not enough to justify keeping him when space and feed were limited. Elias was a man who made decisions with the future of the ranch in mind, not sentiment, and he had reminded Luke more than once that ranching was a business, not a place to collect strays. The morning of the auction dawned hot and cloudless, with a light wind stirring the dust in the yard. Luke woke before first light. His stomach knotted and dressed without speaking. He stepped outside and found the world wrapped in a strange kind of silence, the kind that usually meant a long, scorching day ahead. In the pasture, Rain stood apart as usual, head lifted, staring toward the western hills. Something in the bull's stance made Luke pause. There was a tension in his body, a tautness, as if every muscle were alert to some signal no human could hear. Luke carried the grain bucket out as he always did, but Rain only sniffed at it and turned away. His ears flicked back and forth, his tail swished hard against his flank, and he began to pace in slow, deliberate circles. Luke frowned, remembering the other times Rain had acted like this. Storms had followed each one, but today the sky was painfully blue, without a single cloud. Still, unease crawled up Luke's spine. When Elias appeared with Caleb, one of the ranch hands, and backed the truck up to the loading ramp, Rain's pacing turned into agitation. The bull tossed his head, snorted, and refused to come near the trailer. Dust rose around his hooves as he backed away from the men trying to drive him forward. The scene quickly became tense. Caleb slapped his hat against his leg and cursed under his breath, while Elias's face grew darker. Luke felt the heat rising to his own cheeks. He didn't want to watch this, didn't want to see Rain forced up that ramp, but he couldn't look away. When Caleb tried to swing around behind the bull to prod him forward, Rain spun, his hooves kicking up dirt, and bolted toward the far end of the corral. He stopped just short of the fence, wheeled around, and planted his feet, head high and sides heaving. Elias muttered something about wasting the whole morning and grabbed a lead rope, striding into the corral with the grim determination of a man who would not be defied by livestock. Luke felt something snap inside him. He scrambled over the fence and landed between his father and the bull, his boots sinking into the dry soil. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Rain's breathing and the rasp of the wind across the grass. Elias stared at his son, his expression unreadable, and Luke stared back, chest pounding, fists clenched at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look on his face said everything. He would not move. He would not let them take Rain. The standoff stretched until Caleb shifted uncomfortably and muttered that the bull was just spooked. But Luke didn't move, and finally Elias dropped the rope and stepped back. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard, but something in his expression had changed. Perhaps he saw that this was no longer just about a bull. This was about his son, about the boy's first act of real defiance. Even as the moment passed, the air around them seemed to shift. A breeze stirred from the west, stronger now, carrying with it a faint coolness that felt out of place for a July morning. Luke glanced up and saw that the horizon, which had been clear only an hour ago, now held a faint smear of gray. High clouds were forming, building quickly. The change was so sudden it made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Rain had begun to move again, but not toward the trailer. He was pulling away from it, straining toward the far side of the pasture where the old concrete feed storage building stood. The bull's agitation was no longer just stubbornness, it was urgency. He bellowed once, a deep, resonant sound that echoed across the ranch yard, then took several steps in the direction of the shelter before stopping and looking back, as if waiting for them to follow. Jessica's truck appeared then, rolling into the yard in a plume of dust. The veterinarian stepped out, taking in the scene at a glance, the unhitched trailer, the tense bull, the boy standing in the dirt, his face flushed with stubborn determination. She crossed to Elias and asked what was going on. Elias gestured toward the bull with a weary motion and explained that they were trying to load him for auction, but that the animal wouldn't budge. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked toward the west. She took her phone from her pocket, checked the radar app she used for work, and frowned. Though the morning forecast had predicted clear skies, she was seeing a developing cell far to the west, near the mountains. "It could miss us," she said after a moment, but her voice lacked conviction. "Or it could blow up fast. These summer systems can do that." The wind picked up again, stronger this time, tossing dust across the yard and fluttering the loose sleeves of Caleb's shirt. Rain snorted and pawed the ground, tossing his head toward the shelter. The sense of unease that had been building in Luke's chest since dawn solidified into certainty. He turned to his father, willing him to see what he saw, to understand. Elias stood silent for a long moment, weighing the choice before him. There was still time to force the bull into the trailer, to make the auction and the profit it promised. But the sky was no longer the clear, unbroken blue it had been. Clouds were building rapidly now, piling higher and darker, and the air felt charged, as if some invisible hand were drawing power from the earth. When rain bellowed a second time, louder, more insistent, Elias's decision was made for him. He let out a sharp breath and told Caleb to stand down. The boy's shoulders sagged with relief. Rain wasted no time. The moment the pressure eased, he trotted across the pasture, heading straight for the concrete building at the back of the property. Luke climbed the fence and followed, his boots slipping in the dry soil. He glanced back once at his father, who still stood by the trailer, his hat pulled low against the wind. The look on Elias's face was grim, but there was no stopping Luke now. He hurried after Rain, the bull already disappearing around the corner of the barn, as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. What had started as an ordinary morning of ranch work was shifting into something else entirely. The air smelled of ozone, sharp and metallic, and the light took on a strange, greenish cast. Luke could feel the storm coming, even if it was still miles away. And in that moment, as he followed Rain toward the safest place on the ranch, he realized he no longer doubted the bull's instincts. Rain wasn't just being stubborn, he was warning them. Something was coming, and it was coming fast. By the time Luke reached the concrete feed storage building, the air had changed entirely. What had been a hot and cloudless morning only an hour earlier now felt heavy, the wind pressing against him with an almost physical force. Rain had already pushed himself into the deep back corner of the building, his massive body blocking the entrance for a moment, as if to make sure no danger could follow him inside. When he finally shifted, Luke stepped in after him, heart pounding, sweat and dust streaking his face. Behind them, the sky was no longer blue at all. Dark, churning clouds rolled in from the west, swallowing the light and casting the ranch in a strange, unnatural twilight. Elias and Caleb were still by the trailer when the first gust hit, a wall of wind strong enough to rock the truck on its tires and send a spray of grit across the yard. Jessica shouted something over the rising roar, pointing to the clouds that now loomed over the fields like a living thing. Her phone was still in her hand, radar glowing ominously. She waved toward the barn, urging them to get to shelter, but Elias hesitated, his gaze fixed on the truck and trailer, his jaw clenched. It was the most expensive piece of equipment he owned, and leaving it under the stand of cottonwoods seemed unthinkable. But then came the sound that changed everything. Rain let out a bellow so deep and resonant it seemed to shake the ground itself. It echoed through the yard, through the barns, through Luke's bones. It was not the call of a frightened animal, but a warning, urgent and commanding. Jessica grabbed Elias's arm and shouted that the storm was forming faster than she had ever seen. "Microburst, maybe rotation," she said, but the wind tore her words to shreds. Elias made his decision in an instant. He sprinted for the truck, leapt into the cab, and turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. He drove it forward, pulling it out from under the trees, the trailer rattling wildly behind him as the gusts tried to shove it sideways. The sky overhead boiled darker with every second. By the time Elias had cleared the open yard and swung the truck onto higher ground, Hailstones had begun to fall, sharp and hard as stones, pinging against the metal roof and hood. Luke ducked instinctively as the first of the hail hit the storage building, the noise deafening inside the concrete space. The bull shifted restlessly but did not bolt, his massive body steady, planted as if he knew this was the safest place they had. Jessica and Caleb ran full tilt toward them, heads bent against the pelting ice. Elias abandoned the truck where it stood, engine still running, and raced for the shelter as the wind rose to a howl. When Elias stumbled inside, breathless and streaked with dust, the full force of the storm seemed to arrive with him. The wind screamed like a freight train, rattling the heavy door on its hinges. The hail turned into a barrage, each strike against the roof and walls a hammer blow. Somewhere outside, wood splintered with a sharp crack, followed by the dull crash of something massive hitting the ground. Luke pressed himself against the wall, eyes wide, heart thundering in his chest. For several minutes, there was nothing but noise. Wind, hail, the groaning of trees and buildings outside, as if the whole ranch were straining against the power of the storm. The air smelled of wet dirt and electricity, and every flash of lightning turned the inside of the building pale and ghostly for a heartbeat before plunging them back into darkness. Rain remained near the back wall, head lowered, but still alert, his body like a shield between them and whatever lay outside. Each time the wind rose higher, he stamped a hoof, as if answering the sky's challenge. Luke stayed near him, one hand on the bull's coarse shoulder, grounding himself in the animal's solid presence. Then came the sound that none of them would forget. The sharp crack and splintering roar of the great cottonwood splitting in two, followed by a crash so thunderous it drowned even the storm's howl. When the noise finally ebbed, they could just make out through the small window that the tree had fallen directly across the spot where the trailer had been parked earlier. Even in the dim light, it was clear that the massive trunk had smashed the ground with enough force to flatten anything beneath it. Elias's face went pale as he stared through the glass, rainwater and sweat running down his temples. He did not speak, but his expression told the story. He understood exactly what that meant. If rain had gone into the trailer as planned, if they had been on the road, or even standing near the truck when the tree came down, they might not have survived. The storm raged for what felt like forever, but was, in truth, only minutes. Gradually, the hail began to slacken, the wind dropping from a scream to a steady roar, and then to a howl that trailed off across the plains. When at last there was only the soft patter of rain, Elias eased the door open and stepped outside, scanning the yard. The ranch looked as though a giant had swept a hand across it. Branches and debris littered the ground, the cottonwood a broken monument lying across the mud. The air was cool now, shockingly fresh after the oppressive heat of the morning. The trailer had been spared only because it had been moved at the last moment. The truck sat splattered with mud but undamaged. Jessica walked forward, looking from the fallen tree to Rain, who now stood calmly just outside the shelter, sniffing the wet air as if to confirm that the danger had passed. "He knew," she said quietly, not looking at Elias, but at the bull. "He was warning us." Luke stayed near Rain, his hand still resting on the bull's flank, and for the first time, Elias saw not just his son, but the man he was becoming. The boy had been right. The bull he had wanted to sell had just saved them all. They spent the next hour walking the property, checking for damage, righting what they could. The fences were down in places. A section of the roof on the tool shed was gone, but nothing they could not fix. No animals had been hurt, no one had been injured, and the ranch was still standing. When they finally gathered near the fallen cottonwood, Elias stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the massive tree. "You were right to fight for him," he said at last, his voice low but carrying over the still damp yard. "He stays." It was not just a concession. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of his son's judgment and the bull's strange, undeniable value. Luke felt something shift in that moment, a weight lifting from his chest. He had done it. He had saved Rain, but more than that, he had earned his father's respect. As the sun broke through the last ragged clouds and bathed the ranch in pale, golden light, Rain turned toward the pasture, walking slowly back to join the other cattle. They parted for him as he approached, letting him pass to the center of the field. He stood there for a moment, broad-shouldered and proud, and let out a low bellow that rolled across the quiet ranch like a final note at the end of a song. Luke stood watching him until his father's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. There would be fences to mend, debris to clear, and work to be done. But for now, they simply stood together in the wet grass, looking out at the bull who had changed everything. The sky to the west was already clearing, promising a calmer evening. And somewhere deep inside, Luke felt certain that if another storm ever came, whether of wind and rain or of life itself, Rain would be ready to warn them. And this time, no one would doubt him. The boy who had once been just a child was now a partner in the work of the ranch, and the animal they had almost sold was no longer just a scrawny bull. He was their guardian, their living barometer, and a reminder that sometimes listening to what others ignore can mean the difference between loss and survival. If this story moved you, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.